Well, good evening, everyone. I'm using a microphone because we're live streaming this and also taping it for our YouTube channel. I'm Marianne Brownlow. Welcome to Hill Center at the Old Naval Hospital. Is anyone here for the very first time? Fantastic. Great. I hope you'll come back. We do a lot of different programming here, lectures and conversations, concerts, all sorts of different things. So since 2013, we have hosted this quarterly series we call The Life of a Poet, which is, we think, a very rare opportunity to have a real in depth conversation with a poet, not just about their work, but about their life and about the events in their life that have been consequential to their writing. And for the last several years, we've been incredibly fortunate to have Kyle Dargan, who is himself a poet, an editor, and professor, curating the series as well as moderating the conversations, and he's simply fabulous. So, launching our 2025 series this year is poet librettist Janine Joseph, and I think believe well, you all have programs, know a bit about her background, and I think 3 days after the inauguration day, this is an absolutely critical, crucial, and urgent conversation to be had. And so thank you very much for coming. And at this point, I'll just turn it over to Kyle.
Thank you, as always, Marianne, for all of your work behind the scenes, getting the event together, getting the publicity together, communicating with the poets. There's a lot that goes into making this series happen, and much of that happens on Marianne's back. So we're always thankful for her work uh, on the series. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for bearing the cold and darkness of Washington to come to the event. And then on top of that, there's even the weather. Um, it's, you know, it's an interesting conversation to have right now with the Capitol right in the background, um, knowing, what's probably going on at this very moment. But we're so happy to have you back in Washington. I know the first time you came when the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress were running that series of Kundiman readings, and that's where I first encountered your work. And then when I was thinking about what was going to be happening after we knew where things were going post November, I said it would probably be a good time to invite Janine Joseph back to Washington. So thank you for coming up from Blacksburg and being with us today.
Thank you for having me here. It's quite the wild time to be back. Even just the walk over here, I passed by two people who were having this really intense conversation. And just as we were passing each other, I heard one of them say, "Yeah, but like the mass deportation stuff, is this like what you're going to be doing in law enforcement?" But I didn't get to hear the other person's response. But I'm very interested in those conversations that might be happening too.
Yeah, I mean that's Washington. That's going to be a lot of Tinder first date conversations. Like, so, like, what are you going to be? Um, this, Sally, not a joke. But I guess along those lines, where I wanted to start, some of you, does anyone remember? There used to be a cartoon show called Bobby's World that would come. Some people remember Bobby's World. It was a Howie Mandel, I think, was producing the show, and part of the concept of Bobby's World is like this little child who was experiencing life with his family. And because, Bobby was a child, he would hear adult language, a lot of dead metaphors and other allusions. But because Bobby did not have the context, like he would hear something and his imagination would just go off making like that was something real. So someone might say something about, a table leg, and then he starts going off and imagining like tables running around with legs and not really understanding the dead metaphor. So I was thinking about that and thinking about the language that was coming out of your book, both of the books really. And there's that action concept word, naturalization, right? And I think poets have a particular sensitivity to sort of the texture and import of language, sort of in that same way that Bobby does in the show, right? And I figured since I had you, I just got really curious to know, like, as a poet and as someone who has been through the process themselves, how does your ear, just your ears, I guess maybe even your body too, but how does your ear respond to that language, that concept of naturalization?
At the sonic level, I love that. I really love this question, because naturalization at the sonic level is a really difficult sound. It just doesn't sound well on the line. But I will say that it is at the sound level, at the word level, it is a word and a sound that I'm attracted to because I grew up with three languages, right? So there were three languages spoken in the home when I was growing up in the Philippines. We had English and Spanish and Tagalog. And Tagalog is a firecracker of a language, right? So word like naturalization has a lot going on in it, right? Like it's just exploding at all times. So at the sonic level, it's really interesting. You write it on a line, and it's not so interesting anymore. But I have a really, perhaps unsurprisingly so, difficult relationship with the word itself and all of its meanings. Um, when I was writing Driving Without a License, for most of the time, well, for part of the time that I was writing it, I was already a naturalized citizen. I'd gone through the naturalization process, right? The book was picked up in 2014. I was naturalized in 2011, but it was a word that I did not approach in the work, in this book, um, at all, because I knew that I would be writing Driving Without a License for the rest of my life if I decided to write about having gone through the naturalization process. The moment I had crossed that particular moment in my own life, I knew that there was the next book. I could feel it already. But I didn't know what shape it was going to take. I just knew that it was there, but for the time being, I needed to focus on the life that I had lived before I became a naturalized um, citizen of this country. On a day-to-day level, um, it it feels at all times right a qualifier for me, right? Like if someone, sometimes when people introduce me to other people, they'll say like, "This is Janine. She's a dreamer," which is actually no longer accurate, right? Because I'm a naturalized U.S. citizen now. And so if I'm not introduced as a dreamer, sometimes, people will say like, "Oh, but you're a citizen now." And I'll say, "But I'm a naturalized citizen," because I know that it feels very different, because it was something that I had to earn for a long stretch of time. And it is something that I know can also be taken away. Or I have this fear, but I also kind of know that it can be taken away. And I always use it as this kind of qualifier too, because um, there are some things that still don't feel um, like they come natural to me because I have lived a different kind of life, right? And so sometimes, like friends or even family will say some things, or they will move about in the world in such a way that I think to myself, I can't, like, it's very difficult to even fathom moving in the world without thinking at all times, like, what if I forgot my license? Or what if I didn't have my passport? Or what if, or what if, or what if, what if? And that to me is this naturalized part that I'm still working through. I mean, even in Decade of the Brain, when I was writing about the naturalization process, most of the poems that actually are about the naturalization process are about my father's naturalization. I also don't remember a lot of my own naturalization because I had had a concussion. Um, and so there's chunks that are just gone from that process.
Yeah. So I mean, there are a couple of things from that I want to touch on later. One, sort of the separation that you're talking about, because there's really these two separations that jump out of your work, separating the self. One, uh, after the accident, right? There's the you after the accident, you before, but also there's the you before naturalization and the you after, right? But to that discomfort, and this is one of the things that I found really interesting if I was reading your work, um, in that context of it presenting an immigrant experience, is the thing that I found myself really thinking the least about as I was revisiting your writing is assimilation, right? In the sense that, and you can correct me, if I'm wrong, but the idea that assimilation is achievable in a comfortable way is not one of the things that I think comes out of your writing, because I feel like to be naturalized, right, is to more so exist on an uncomfortable edge and not ever really arrive, right, at something that feels like very, very solid. I don't know if you would agree or disagree.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Um, I I don't know. Do you want me to say a little bit more about my own assimilation?
I mean, you can if you want to. I don't want to force, but if you're open to it, sure.
This will also add another kind of level to the various Janines that we've already that have already arrived into this room. We've summoned them. Um, I, my first career began when I was 3 years old. I was an actress in the Philippines, and so there was this other kind of Janine that learned to inhabit different characters. Um, and I don't think my assimilation into this country would have been the same had I not learned how to inhabit characters and how to study characters and how to study the way people spoke. Because I arrived to this country and I quickly just listened to what my classmates were saying, watched what they did, and then began to assume a character. Um, and so it helped me, I would say. Um, One of the kind of very important movies in my upbringing was Clueless, because I figured out, right, like if you talk like a valley girl in Southern California, you'll sound like you're from Southern California, or at least you're part of some part of Southern California. But I incorporated a lot of the like the body movements, right, the like the weight on one leg kind of being tilted out, the use of likes, which helped me sound like some of the people in the schoolyard, but also quite painful because it is now just how I sound, having not even grown up in the valley, and I'm painfully aware of the way that I came to learn to speak. As an American, sometimes in conversations and places where speaking this particular way is kind of looked down on. Like I've had other people say like, well, you're using these words, but it's understandable.
Plan on this, but I told myself I would be better about not getting too far into the conversation without having some poetry. Would you mind reading that poem?
Yes, yeah. I tried to bookmark some of these poems. Okay, I've got. So this is in Driving Without a License. It's certainly a poem that the moment I wrote it, I was thinking there's an essay in this, but I haven't written that essay yet. Yeah, so this is called Assimilation. It was only a matter of time. I raised my voice from the second story and did not respond, perdón. I had down the valley girl like, hugged my binder and books close to my chest, like in Clueless, all of my weight on one leg so the other could be all like this. First, what? Then, whatever. The disrespectful American words stinking up his house. my held breath as I waited for him to set the pestle down, the cutting board, the stalks, the cleaver, everything in his hands, out of his hands.
The disrespectful American words stinking up his house. I remember how that line jumped out of me. Then that's the one place where I think about, you know, the generational experience within immigration, right? It's like at what point you want your child to become more like the country they're assimilating into, but then at the same time, at some point, you have to deal with that child um, that is being created, and I feel like that was captured so well in that moment. So you know, we've talked about you know, these different Janines. Maybe we can talk about um, one of the other ways in which that is functioning in the work, which is as it relates to your recovery from the car accident. So I was wondering if from decade of the brain to shift. Um, I do want to get to erasure, but maybe we won't start there. Um, so could we maybe do Into the Gansfield or Four Darks in Red? You can
Which one do you want to hear?
you can choose between those two. I think you know they both sort of speak to.
I'll read Into the Gansfeld. I haven't read that one in a very long time. Usually I read Four Darks and Red because it feels nice sometimes to have those bees moving around. But I'll do Into the Gansfeld, um, which is a term that I learned uh, moving around like a James Turrell light exhibit where, so a Gansfeld, um, essentially when you're in a Gansfeld, it's almost you experience this complete sensory deprivation. And so the when I walked into this light exhibit, like you couldn't see where the ceiling became the wall became the floor, and you couldn't tell how far you were from any of these things. You just knew that you were in this color, in this space. Um, and so this is where I get into the Gansfeld. With my grief counselor, I talk about hallucinating as a child, a double on the dashboard, and my double would say, "Don't you say a word," though I'd already be looking past myself and at the horizon of taillights reddening. It is possible to have been this way even then. Even then, it is possible something split in me the first time I lied myself a citizen. At the tilt of a head, was I the young woman or the old, the duck or the rabbit in the optical illusion? After the accident, I turned out all of the lights in the room while I watched, concussed from the mirror. I edged like a fever with nothing on the tip of my tongue.
Um, I really love that little movement at the end where it's I watched concussed, um, and what you don't expect there is from the mirror, right? Because then you're talking about the other self that is inside the reflection, sort of doubling down on that idea of the separation. So, um, as I mentioned before, you know, reading both books, noticing how much, right, this framework of the split self colors these various aspects um, of your life. My initial question was, does that ever get overwhelming? And then I sort of thought for that for a while. I was like, of course it probably does. So, better question. I think the question, what I really want to know is, after all of this, right? What does wholeness feel for you, like for you right now, as a person, as a poet, right? What does wholeness feel like, given that you worked through all of this, all of these different forms of separation? Like, where or what is wholeness for you right now?
I don't know. I mean, I th- I think at this point there's nothing that exhilarates me more than knowing that within me are a number of Janines. Like I feel like at all times, um, there are multiple Janines in me, and I think before, right, like I'd mentioned having this career as an actress from age 3 to 9, right, and then I immigrated to this country, right. So there's this like pre-America Janine and then America Janine. And then there's the Janine that was undocumented. There was Janine that had a temporary visa. There was a Janine that had conditional residency. There was a Janine that became a naturalized U.S. citizen. And then there's this Janine of a car accident that happens between conditional residence and naturalization. And when the car accident happened, all of the Janines were out. In that, because I had lost so much of my memory, and because I was trying to, I don't even know if I can say trying to regain my memory, because it's not like there was a box and I found the memory, all the memories in a box. Everything was there all at once, and everything was also not there all at once. So, for example, I could be driving on the road, and then I would wonder, this person who I'm going to see, is this someone who knows I'm undocumented, or who thinks I'm documented? But I'm having those questions while I'm documented, right? So I I couldn't tell the difference between the the undocumented self and the documented self for quite a while, right? Because I no longer, all of my filing cabinets in my brain were tipped over, essentially. And then, right, there's this before the accident Janine, and then there's this after the accident Janine, but there's no clear line between those two Janines.
I mean, I feel like the book is in a way trying to
Yes, trying to
create
trying
that.
to absolutely make sense of all of those different Janines, and like I think it feels strange to kind of talk about them. I worry sometimes that people worry about me when I talk about, right, the multiplicity of Janines, but I've lived
You
so many
poet
kinds of
contain multitudes. It's all right. It's
yes, that's usually what I say, but then I'm like, but I mean it, and then it creeps people out, right?
I think Walt meant it too, but yes.
But
you-
that kind of wholeness, right? Like I'm made up of all of that, and I take comfort in all of them because all of them had a hand in getting this Janine to where she is right now, right? I had a dream maybe about a year ago. I'm a lucid dreamer, but I had this really peculiar dream one night where I was part of it is like the dream logic that doesn't make sense because it was like I was in a cult, or I'd been taken, abducted by a cult, and I was washing my hands in the kitchen, and I looked out the window, and across this yard, and I saw my house, or I knew it was my house, um, and a bunch of Janines ran out of the house. And so I ran out of the cult house and I tried to grab all of the Janines, right? And I wrestled two down and one left. And I woke up from the dream and thought, that's book 3.
you know that I was going to ask you if you've written that poem. So.
I'm still, is it a poem or is it the book? I have to go. It was not long after Decade of the Brain came out, and I was like, Janine's up here. I get it.
Yeah, Sandra Beasley, who was a guest of the series before, and we were also classmates at the University of Virginia, and so we both had Rita Dove as teachers, and she would talk about how those sort of moments where, as a poet, you're like, I probably really should process this in some other way, but I really need to write this poem because I know if I don't, I'm missing out on something good. And that was right. At first, like the first place my mind went was like, oh my God, please tell me she started writing that poem because we need that.
I haven't found the vantage point into it yet. Before I used to chase the earworm, right? For driving without a license, it was always what is the lion sound like, and that sound would dictate the rest of the poem. With Decade of the Brain, I think largely because I lost my hearing for a while after the accident. My relationship to how a poem began from different vantage points, and I think it was largely probably because I didn't have access to memory, so it feels like at all times my brain was trying to figure out like where I can feel that there's a memory here, but how do I get into the memory? And so I'm beginning from all of these different angles or different vantage points, but I feel like because I haven't figured that part out, this is how I also know that it's part of something else. And as soon as I figure that out, then I'll figure out like what is the entry point for the next book.
So we'll be patient. Um, and for those of you who don't have the book, though, I see some of you do. If you look at Into the Gansfeld, you can see that it's sort of split um, across the page and the way the stanzas move. Um, and there's a lot of that in this book, which is also like as I was reading, I picked up sort of there's a conceptual element of the split, but it also seems like there's a very conscious effort to also formally on the page suggest that split or that rift in the poems. Um, Another take on that, if you wouldn't mind reading this, is Erasure, um, which maybe for those who are unfamiliar with the form, as I was at first, of the burning high bun. Um, so people know that the traditional high bun is uh, the prose poem where one is sort of focused on the environment and nature, followed by the haiku, which is sort of something of the more internal reflection at that point. The burning high bun kind of flips that a bit, but I'll let you say more about it if you want to before you read the
Yeah,
piece.
yeah. So this was a poem that didn't have shape until I came across Torn A Great House's invented form, the Burning High Bun. And so it begins with a prose block that then you erase from, and then turn whatever you have left from that erasure into a haiku. And when I say it's a poem that didn't have shape, it's because I was working with um, one of the very, very, very few documents that I have from a doctor's visit. Because my big car accident in 2008 happened in California, and I was not living in California at the time. I was living in Houston, and so I was visiting my family over winter break. Had this car accident, was just there for maybe about 1 week more, and they just mostly wanted to make sure that I could board a plane by myself. And then I flew back to Houston, a city that I had just moved to, and so no one really knew me. Um, and so I don't have a lot of records from when the accident happened. But as I was kind of going through any material I could for the making of this book, I came across a write up of myself. Um, and I kept thinking about how, the records that someone else keep determine your level of care after that point. And I was just kind of really amazed at the poor quality of care that I received after my car accident. And so the prose block that I start with is what was written about me. And then I erase it, and then I turn it into a haiku. So this is called Erasure, and it begins with a name that is not my name, because it's a misspelling of my name that the doctor had written. And it's spelled Janine, Jeannine, and then Joseph. Um, and this is from 2010. History. The patient is a 27-year-old right-handed female. 2 weeks ago, on the 19th of May, she was at the gym. She began feeling nauseous and nearly vomited. She walked out to get some air, but noticed spots before her eyes. Her vision seemed blurred, the room color seemed different, and she developed a right-sided headache. She took a break, walked over to the student health clinic, went home, and after a nap, all of her symptoms had resolved with no medications or interventions. She has never had a previous episode such as this, and no problems since. She does have regular headaches, frequently, that are mainly a tension type headache in the base of her neck that can last days at a time, but generally do not require medications. She uses an orthopedic pillow and massage. In 2008, she was involved in a motor vehicle accident in which her vehicle was rear ended. She apparently suffered a concussion at the time, was seen at XXX, where CAT scans and subsequent MRI was negative. She then flew back to her home in Houston and had been followed by Dr. XXX and physical therapy for a year or so until she was released. She complains of being tired during the day, falling asleep during class, forgetting a lot, repeating herself. She gets lost. She switches words typing, has word recognition and spelling problems, and cannot multitask. If she overworks her brain, she says her brain, quote, stops connecting, and she has to nap. She is, however, completing her PhD in literature and works as a counselor. And now this is the erasure. Janine. The patient feeling nauseous, she noticed spots. Her vision blurred the room, a headache, a break. Frequently, a tension, her neck, days at a time. 2008, she was rear-ended, suffered a concussion. She complains of being asleep, forgetting herself, lost switches, her brain, she says, her brain. And the haiku. She began feeling. She apparently suffered. She is, however,
You can really feel how, in a way, it gets a bit more distant as we move on, and like with less language, even like with all the detail that's there. You know, there's something that isn't there in the doctor's note. Sort of like gradually we get closer to that, with the erasure. I want to talk a bit more about form. There's so much, form work in all these books. The Hustle, the High Bun, the Sonnet. But before that, and I do have some students here, and this is like one of the things that I think a lot about right now, as someone who is working with people who are becoming poets. And like some people know, you may not know, like I'm in and out. I'm not really writing books anymore. Part because I'm just trying to figure out what place the poetry book has in the current moment. Um, but I'm curious for you, as someone like this book came out last year, you definitely plan on. We're basically talking through the next book right now. Um, what is it like for you to try to be sort of an active and engaged poet in this moment? And I think one of the things that's complicating that right now, obviously, is what I remember from the last Trump administration is that people are often very angry or very distracted or fearful, right? All three of those things which are exhausting, right? So I think in some way we have to assume that we are trying to reach an already exhausted audience, like with what we're doing. Um, like how do you do that? Like how do you manage that? How do you navigate finding the people that you want to connect with right now, given all the various distractions and the ways that it seems as though we are more and more sort of retreating within ourselves, as opposed to sort of making those connections that often defined a lot of poetry communities sort of before recent events.
Um, well, when I found out I was undocumented, it was 2001. Um, And when I found out I was undocumented, I learned a lot of the language that was used for quote unquote people like me in newspapers, right? And so it's like there was this conversation that was already happening. There were laws that were happening. In fact, I was living in this country when laws had occurred that changed my status in this country, right? I arrived in 91. 1996 was a big year. Clinton administration did a whole lot of damage to the criminalization of immigrants, and I had to catch up, right? Like I had to read all of this history, and in 2001, I kind of saw what it was that I was doing in an entirely new way, right? Like I was writing poems about my heartbreak in high school before I found out I was undocumented, and then I almost didn't get it. Almost didn't get to go to college, and so I thought I need to have a plan. I need to be able to do something that I can do without permission, right? And so I began writing poetry in a very, very different way. And I think because I already had that in me in 2001, it feels like I'm still doing that work. And so it doesn't feel like I'm necessarily just responding to what is happening right now, right? It feels like something had set in motion, and I have been following the path. And this is again part of me thinking the past Janines is that wherever I am now is a path that got set on by a Janine that feels very distant to me, but she set me on a path. Um, I'm still also kind of thinking about what you had said about, you know, what is the place of like a poetry book in this particular moment. Personally speaking, right, like when Decade of the Brain came out, Marcelo Hernandez Castillo and Esther Lynn, who are my co-organizers for UndocuPoets, we were, you know, texting with each other because most of our interactions are entirely just by text since we live in different states. And we were so excited as a that one of us had a second poetry collection coming out, right? Because it was like my book came out, Javier Zamora's book came out, Marcelo Hernandez Castillo's book came out, Christopher Soto, who was, right, so Christopher Soto, Marcelo and Javi were the co-founders of UndocuPoets, right? So these three poetry collections came out. And then we've had collections by Alini Mello come out, by Wo Chan come out, right? Esther Lynn has a book that's about to come out, right? Like, so and Annie Liu had a book come out, Jan Henry Gray had a book come out, right? So it's like there are all of these poets who are either currently or formerly undocumented, and our first books have come out. And we've been writing about growing up undocumented or being undocumented. But then the second, right, like we were like, whoa, what does this mean that the second book comes out and is doing a different kind of work, or even just showing that there's a second book, right, in poetry. This to me feels like a way of being reminded about the closeness that one can have even in these like larger times, right? Like we're adding to this narrative, and we're making this narrative about the lives of undocumented people far more complicated with every single book that comes out. But there's this like private joy that we're sharing by text of just like, whoa, what does it mean to even just like come out with a second book, right? Like it isn't just that we have one book that comes out and that's the end, right? Like that's the only story that anyone is interested in hearing from us, right? Like this is like how I'm able to kind of keep moving. And even if I'm not working on my own poems, right? Like the work that I do with UndocuPoets, right? Like helping other poets by doing what I do best, which is asking other people for money and moving that money elsewhere, right? Like this feels to me still part of, like, even when I feel like I can't write a poem, or even if I can't quite figure out how to get into the next book or what even the next book might look like, this feels to me like still part of the work, right? Because it's really also important for me that that the narrative continues to be really complicated, and that we continue to have really, really complicated feelings about what it means um, to become a part of this country through literature. I'm like, I'm deeply energized. I don't know how to. It feels like a terrible confession to make in the quote unquote times that we live in, but it's like I feel like the work is still going, right? The work has been there, the work has been moving. We are still kind of working through this. Some of it I think is just not public too, and I think maybe that might be a little important, right? Like, um, in coming together as a community. Like, DocuPoets recently had a community write-in, but it was not a public thing, right? Like, we reached out to people and we just all got together and wrote, and it was not a public-facing event, and that felt really important.
No, I think it sounds like for you, the stakes are very clear. And I guess that's like one of the other things that I'm trying to figure out, trying to have others figure like what are the stakes for you right now as a poet, right? Because you could just push through and just write as you've known how to do, but if you're not doing that with some kind of a attention or awareness uh, of what the particular stakes are for you at this moment, like you might be missing something.
Yes, and sometimes the stakes may not even be entirely with me, right? Like, it might be more important for me um, to do whatever I can to support another poet who can continue to support another poet and can put this book out and put a next book out into the world. I right like I think what it means to be a poet at this time, but really at any time, is thinking about my relationship to other people. It'll it's a lot if I think like what is the one thing I need to do in this particular moment, right? Um, I'm kind of a helper, but I think the way of helping sometimes it looks very different. Sometimes the best way to help is to lead. Sometimes the best way to help is to help, right? Like it can take all these different forms. Um, I like to check in with my UndocuPoet fellows and say like, what's the manuscript looking like? Like, where can we make sure that we can send things off to? Like right now, I have my eyes really on. Believe it or not, despite the fact that the first UndocuPoets petition um, came out in 2015, right? Like we're a decade into the work of the beginning of UndocuPoets, and there still exists opportunities that are not open to people who are not citizens of this country. Like this is what I'm really interested in, right? In those passport checks.
Before we run out of time, I want to make sure we get to the talk through with the piece that you all have. And this is funny because when I mentioned to Janine that I wanted to do this piece, and she was like, "I never read this piece." And I said, "Great." But then her reason why was that it's a weightlifting poem, and I had to inform her that DC is the fittest city in America, and that if there's anywhere to read this poem, it is here. Um, but two, for me, why I really focused on this piece was that I got a sense it was informed by the duplex form, which we'll talk about a bit. And I have a bit of I don't want to say a gripe, not with the form, but with the way people have engaged with the form, because I mean, it's fairly new, a form invented by Jericho Brown. And the thing about it is, usually, forms exist for some time before they begin to be sort of deconstructed in various ways. And this is just a new form. And I remember when I first saw the duplex in Jericho's book, and then maybe for that year I saw other people, sort of copying the duplex in the strict form. And then it was like a month later, and everyone was doing their own thing with the duplex. I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, don't we have to let this form sort of just live as it is for a moment before we all start taking it apart? I had the same reactions to the golden shovel when Terrence Hayes started sending it, and the next thing I know, like everyone was doing whatever the heck they want to do with the golden shovel, and I was like, well, wait a minute, like are we all doing the same thing? John Coltrane. There's this quote that I often attribute to Coltrane. I think it's true. I'm not sure. Um, but it says that you have to sort of learn the note before you start playing around the note. Um, and this isn't so much about your poem in particular, because I think I can see why you're playing with the duplex. But I wanted to talk about how you play with the duplex in this poem. So, we can have you read it first, please, and then I'll have some additional questions about the piece.
I love that prelude. I really love it.
I just wanted to be clear about the stakes
Yes.
of the.
Though, when
before.
I was writing, I was like, this is going to get me in trouble. But then I was like, thinking about all the people who like use form without really thinking about how they're using form. Because also, right, like I have a hustle in driving without a license, and then I have a double hustle in this book. I really like my approaches with form are like my approaches to immigration forms.
I was going to ask you a question like that, so I'm glad.
yes, yeah. Though I've never written a poem that plays with an immigration form, because for me, it's like there's nothing fun about that. There's just nothing fun about the immigration form. So this is at the Hawthorne Barbell Club, and yes, absolutely, it makes a nod to the duplex, and it opens with an epigraph by Jericho Brown that says, "Memory makes demands darker than my own. Now I am sure I heard the air leave me. Where over the seat belt did my matter go? Where did I go, slumped over the seat belt? What use is a skull if the mandible slacks? What use is the body that cracked in the ambulance comedy? Did stand up on the gurney into the mask? I gagged through my oxygen at the hospital. A snooze no caregiver thought to wake me. But in this garage, two put my rest to use. At the rack, they load my bar with weights. 2 by 2, they clamp the bumper plates. At me, they whoop, elbows down, fight it. At me, they whoop, elbows down, fight it. So loud, I can't hear the air heave me.
And I also think it's nice to talk about the duplex form on Capitol Hill, since there are a number of duplexes in the area, so people sort of know about the duplex architecturally, right? It's where you have sort of two units pressed together into one house. And formally, how that works on the page, right, which you'll notice in the traditional, feels weird to say a traditional duplex is that's not 10 years old, but a traditional duplex is the second line in the couplet before repeats as the first line in the next couplet. So you have that clear repetition from the penultimate stanza into the last stanza, right? If you're people that understand how it works, right? So what I find interesting, particularly in this book with this duplex, is that transition from the first stanza into the second. Because we read that second line, where over the seatbelt did my matter go, right? And so with the duplex, the idea is that that line gets repeated in some way. Often you do a little transposition with the syntax in this poem too, but so the line comes back, where did I go, slumped over the seatbelt. And what I think is interesting about that is if you're aware of what a duplex is supposed to do, you ask yourself, okay, well, what is the change telling me? And the change that I notice across those two stanzas is that if we're looking at a repetition, matter turns into I in the next line, which in the context of this book, I find really interesting. Because we talk about the separated self, right? And there are the ways in which the body is just a body. It's just matter. It's even a different body in some poems. And then there's the self, the I. So I feel like that shift that you're doing in so many other parts of the poem happens across those two couplets, with that shift that you make in this particular duplex. I
I wasn't gonna go into duplex and disrespect it.
appreciate it.
At all. I really, I really love working in form. And I think I've enjoyed working in form more after my accident. Right, like sometimes people say, like after they experience a traumatic brain injury, right, like they become these math wizards, right? Or they suddenly become painters and they didn't know how to draw before that, or suddenly they know how to speak a foreign language. I like to say that like the thing that that lights up my brain are poetic forms now, and how those existing structures can kind of like withstand the weight of my thinking, and how they might move in the weight of my thinking. But then I'm also thinking, but before the accident, I was thinking about form the way that I did immigration forms and how it was that I was responding to the demands of this country. But it was really important for me not to walk into the rooms of the duplex and disrespect it. I hope Jericho Brown feels that way when I was like, please don't be mad at me when I was writing this. But I think you're a really incredibly generous reader in noticing those shifts between those stanzas. Where at all times I was trying to think about like the movement of my own memory, right? Like in the thing that happened and what I remember of the thing that happened, right? There's a kind of like, it's there's an approximation that's happening, right? Like so moving from like comedy, did stand up on the gurney into the mask, right? Like then I gagged through, right? Like through my oxygen at the hospital, and then moving from like wake me to rest, right? Like there's this, I was really trying to write towards what my memory was doing post accident, and how I could be someone who is under 193 pounds of weight and thinking, is this what my breath sounded like when it left me? And suddenly having this memory of the breath leaving me when I have no memory of the accident at all. I just had, it was like suddenly I felt the same breath come out of me as I did when I could have died. Right, and so it's like that is happening, and so this is kind of drawn from an actual kind of experience. And my friend who was coaching me at the time was like, I need you to pay attention because you're carrying a lot of weight and you could be injured. But my mind was somewhere else. And I was like, there has to be a way of like writing into that space.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it speaks to the urgency of that experience that you had, not the weightlifting, but the car accident, because right, like, and I will admit I was deadlifting the day before I decided to pick this poem. I don't think that had anything to do with it, but um, the idea in that moment is like you're supposed to have this sort of like pristine focus, right? In part so you don't hurt yourself, but also because one of the really interesting things I heard a weightlifter say once is like one of the things that you're supposed to do when you lift weights is to thank the weight, because it's giving you this opportunity to just focus on one thing, like when your life, like you're supposed to thank the weight for that, and that even this moment where you are sort of lifting that heavy weight, like your brain still can't do that, right? Because the experience is still fighting its way back up to the front. One last question about it. So the gym doesn't come in until about the fifth stanza, but the title is At the Hawthorne Barbell Club. So I'm just curious, like, when did you decide that that's the way I want people going into this poem, even though we're not going to get to that until basically the closing third of the piece?
It felt really important to have that title as this frame, right? That like at all times I'm in the garage. I mean, so my friend who was training me would joke and called it the Hawthorne Barbell Club, and I was like, this is the best poem title.
Mm.
But it's like at all times, even as those thoughts are occurring to me, I'm still in the barbell club, right? And so it was important for me to enter that space. Also, right, like, when I'm working with my students, I'm thinking about like what can the title be doing that is a little different, right? Like, I knew I was writing a poem that was going to go in a car accident book, and I wasn't going to put like another car accident poem, right? Like another poem with dealing with memory. But it was really important for me to just have that there and begin with the things that are in the head before, right? Like, I have these two people who are like, focus, or your legs are gonna give out.
Yeah, that, that makes sense. So I get it. We're technically out of time, so I don't want to keep people too long because the temperature is dropping by the minute. Um,
I'm sorry, I tell a lot of stories.
no, that's one of the things I always tell my students is like if you wanna understand a book, don't ask someone to tell you how they wrote it. Ask them to tell you the story of the book, because you'll get all these other things that you won't get if you just try to go directly to how did you make this. Um, I wanted to give you some time or space to just talk about. I mean, you've already done so already, but where do you see yourself trying to take undocu poets and the poets, who are the writers, not just poets, who are involved in the organization now, with what is going to be in front of you for the foreseen future?
That's a big question. Um, there are a lot of things that I would like to have happen within DocuPoets. There are a lot of things that I would like to see happen in our own literary community. Um, because, as I mentioned, right, there still exists a number of different opportunities that are still closed off. Even after the Pulitzer Prize announcement, right? Like, even after they opened up their eligibility guidelines, even after the National Book Award opened their eligibility guidelines, not everything is open, right? So I have my eyes on that. Marcelo, Esther, and I talk all the time. We don't make moves without each other. We need to do whatever we need to do for our own community, our own actual fellows. A lot of that is often private. That's kind of one of the magical things about Undocu Poets, right? Like, even when someone becomes a fellow, we leave it to them to decide whether they want us to be public about them being a fellow, right? Like, because it's not for us, it's for them. I'm interested in being able to give more money to fellows, in being able to create more opportunities for fellows. Whether that's like a retreat down the road, I'm not entirely sure. Those are decisions that I make with Marcelo and Esther. Sometimes I also think that, like, one of the greatest things that can happen with an organization is that we don't need them anymore. And so, I mean, we're kind of like a little scrappy trio. We don't pay ourselves with the work that we do. We gather, we disperse, we gather, we share memes, um, but we haven't thought that far into the future. It feels scary to lay something down without knowing what the landscape looks like at that time and how we can best respond to the landscape at that time, right? Like, if we think too far in the future, it's like predetermining how we're even going to be classified years from now. Like, we know that what it means to be documented, undocumented, these things change all the time, right? And so we have to best respond in that particular moment, um, as it comes, which runs completely counter to how I live my own life, which is I like to have a plan, I like to have strategies. But DocuPoets is an entire, like, it is even beyond me, which is one of the great things about it.
Godspeed to you all in your work, and thank you again for being here with us. Just a reminder that we do have books from East City Bookshop if you do want to get your work signed. And I just ask that we all give one last round of applause to Janine Joseph for being with us tonight. get home safely?